So, can you imagine having a Bible and asking to find something in the Bible, and the Bible did not have either chapters or verses? How would you do that? You would have to, that's right. Well, the Bible was not divided up into chapters until the late Middle Ages. We're talking the 14th to the 16th century. That's when it was divided up into chapters, okay? And then it was several centuries after that that it was divided up further into verses. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was translations. Okay, translations are more complicated than you might think because of several different factors. Now, we use a translation, and most Protestant churches use the same translation, which is, what is it called? No? The New Revised Standard Version. Okay, so where did the New Revised Standard Version come from? Okay, you have to go into the story of the translations of the Bible into the English language, because there's a progression, okay? This wasn't the first one, there was some before that, but the first one that was recognized as an authoritative translation that you could trust was the King James Version. That was the first one.
Is that the one Luther did?
No.
No.
But Germans continue to use the Luther's translation to this day.
Oh, wow.
They do, yeah.
Well,
Okay, so the first English translation was the King James Version. It's called the King James Version because it was King James who instigated the translation of the Bible. He gathered the scholars, the best scholars. I don't know if Oxford was the best university back then, or Cambridge, or whatever. But he gathered the best scholars of the day, and they translated directly from Hebrew and Greek, okay? Old Testament is written in Hebrew, with the exception of Daniel, which is also written in Aramaic. And the New Testament is written in what's called Koine Greek. Koine Greek is not the same as classical Greek. Koine Greek is common Greek. It's the Greek that was spoken as the official language of business and commerce and everything else during Roman times. All right, so it's just like English is today. And say you've got an Arab-speaking person and a Japanese-speaking person, and they need to communicate with each other. What do you think they speak? English, that's exactly right. They speak English, yeah. So in the same sense, Greek was the language of the Roman Empire, and that's why all of the New Testament was written in Greek. So it could be communicated, empire-wide.
Okay, so translating. Now there's a number of problems with translations. The first one to mention is the fact that we have a variety of versions of every book in the Bible. Now, some are older than others, but you can't assume that the older version is necessarily the most accurate version, because these manuscripts, how do you suppose they were produced? There wasn't a printing press, so what did they do? They were handwritten, okay? And the monks could make mistakes like anybody else, okay? So mistakes were made. And what complicates Hebrew in particular is that written Hebrew does not include the vowels. You've got to know what the vowels are, okay? So, and you read it from right to left, not from left to right. And you read it from the back. This would be the beginning of the book, back here, right? You go this way, and you're reading in the opposite direction that we're used to reading. So Hebrew is complicated. Greek is a lot easier. Koine Greek is once you know the alphabet. So getting back to manuscripts. So we've got manuscripts of different ages. Now, there was, with respect to the Old Testament, we got lucky in the year, I think it was also 1948 when the state of Israel was founded. What was found in the year 1948 in the Judean desert, just opposite the Dead Sea?
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, yeah. Those are the oldest manuscripts we have. And there are fragments, not whole books. We have an entire manuscript of the book of Isaiah, for example, but there are fragments of every book in the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther. There's fragments of all of them, okay? So that helped, okay? Before that, we had manuscripts from the 4th century AD. Okay, that's like, you know, how many years after the original was written? That's a long time. And so, so the first thing a translator has to do is figure out which manuscript is the most accurate. There are ways of doing that. They've developed scientific ways of doing that. And what you will discover if you have a study Bible is that there will be little footnotes in the manuscript, not with numbers, but with letters. And if you look down, I don't have my glasses on now, so I can't read, but if you look down to where the letter is at the bottom, it'll say, other authorities read this. In other words, they will tell you that the manuscript they're reading says what they've translated, but other manuscripts say something else. And there's really no way of knowing exactly which one is the original. But none of the variations make a big difference in terms of the meaning of the text. So there's that. You don't really have to worry about it. But it's you know, for translators, it's important to know exactly what the original said. Okay, so you've got the manuscript issue, you've got the issue of language, and here's another issue. I have a cousin who used to work for Wycliffe. You know what Wycliffe is? Yeah. They translate Bibles. And he was a linguist. He was sent to Africa to a tribe that has a spoken language, but their spoken language does not have a written form to it. So he had to figure out how to transform that spoken language into a written language so that he could translate the Bible in their language so that they could understand it. That was quite a task. So there are a lot of different issues that go into translating the Bible, and those are just a few of them. Now, at the time that the King James Bible was translated, does anybody know, based on the language in the King James Version, what do you guess was the period of time in which it was translated?
Mine has a date in it.
Well, that's probably the date
It
when
says,
that one
being
was.
the version set forth 1611 AD.
That's it, yeah. During Elizabethan English. Yeah. It's the same language as Shakespeare's language. Yeah. Okay, so this is Elizabethan English in the King James Version. All right, so we don't speak Elizabethan language anymore, right? So in the 1950s, it was decided we needed a new translation of the Bible, but they didn't want to start from scratch. In other words, rather than starting with going back to the original Hebrew and Greek, what did they do? They went back to the King James Version. Okay? Now, they did use information that they had learned about Hebrew and Greek that they didn't know at the time of the King James Version to help update the translation. But in the 1950s, they did a new translation, and does anybody know what that translation was called?
Is that the Revised Standard?
Revised Standard Version, yeah. RSV. Revised Standard Version.
Oh,
They call it revised because it's the King James Version revised.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, so when you buy, if you look at Bibles, if you go to a Bible bookstore, and it says it's a translation, that means that the version you're reading was translated directly from the original languages. If it's a version, it means it is based on a previous translation. Okay? All right. And then, not that long after that, I don't know what year it was, but they decided they needed yet another translation of the Bible. And I know about this one because the translating committee, it was a committee of scholars, and the guy in charge was my professor of New Testament at Princeton. Okay? So, this is the best translation. Take my word for it. That one's called the what?
Is that the new revised?
New Revised Standard Version, okay? That's the one we use now. That's the one we use now.
Is that what yours says?
Yeah. Okay, so you got King James, Revised Standard, and New Revised Standard. And each one, is based, on not just on previous translations, but also on what they've learned about the language since then. Okay, now one other thing I just want to mention, there are also, now who uses the New Revised which Christian body uses the New Revised Standard Version? And I don't mean by that a particular denomination. I mean, what branch of Christianity uses it?
I would assume Protestant.
Protestantism,
Catholic, yeah.
Protestants, okay? So you've got Protestants, you've got Catholics, and you've got Orthodox, okay? The Orthodox and the Catholics have their own versions, their own translations. The most well-known Catholic translation is called the Jerusalem Bible. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that's what it's called. And does it reflect Catholic doctrine? I don't know, I have never read it, but my guess is it probably does.
Quick question, so throughout these different versions of and I suppose different churches too, has the order of the books as they're printed remained the same, the basic structural, or have they been shuffled or combined or consolidated? If I'm looking at an older Bible, am I going to see the same books as?
It depends on whether you're looking at a Catholic or a Protestant Bible.
Okay. All right.
Okay, the Catholic Bible includes, okay, at the time of Jesus, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, included books that are not included in it today. Books like Tobit, the Maccabees, various ones. Okay? That was called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a word that means 70 in Greek, because the theory was that 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, all sat down by themselves, translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and all 70 of them ended up with the same manuscript. It's another way of saying they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Right? Okay. All right. The Septuagint was accepted as the Old Testament by the Roman Catholic Church. In the year 100 AD, after the Jews had been kicked out of Palestine, that's the end of the Jews in Palestine. Okay, the Romans destroyed Israel in 70 in Jerusalem. There was a second rebellion, and they kicked them out, and it was never called Palestine back then. Do you know where the word Palestine comes from? The Romans gave it the name Palestine.
As a slap in the face.
Yeah, yeah. They were recreating it. They renamed Jerusalem something else too. Okay, so they called it Palestine instead of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Okay, so in 100 AD, a group of people who were the descendants of the Pharisees gathered in a coastal city by the name of Jamnia, coastal to the Mediterranean Sea. And they needed to decide whether or not the Septuagint was going to be the Bible, or whether there were books in there that shouldn't be in there, that shouldn't be considered authoritative. And they took a bunch out. Okay? Martin Luther thought that that group got it right. So the Protestant Bible is based on the one created in Jamnia in 100 AD, and the Catholic Bible is based on the Septuagint. Yeah.
But going forth from that one, within the Protestant realm, has the books of the Bible essentially held? Have they had the same books?
They're all the
Not
same.
necessarily.
They're
They're all the same? Okay.
Content too, right?
Okay.
All the same, which is why the Christian Church has never acknowledged Mormonism as a Christian denomination
That was what,
because they've added to the Bible.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so if you turn to page 2, in Jewish tradition, we're talking now obviously about the Hebrew Bible. There are 3 sections. The first section is called the Torah. Torah means both wisdom or insight and law. It means both. Okay, so for the Hebrews, a law isn't just a rule. It's to be understood as something to live by that is based on a deep wisdom or understanding of how a person should live. Okay. Now the Torah consists of how many books of the Bible?
5.
5. Which 5?
First part, Genesis or something.
Well, okay. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay? And the idea is that who wrote those
Well, of course.
5 books? Okay, they start with creation, as you all know, those of you who are in the Genesis class. They start with the stories of creation, and they end, the book of Deuteronomy ends with what event? Anybody know? The death of Moses. The death of Moses, yeah. Okay. Moses died on Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is in current-day Jordan. And if you go to the top of Mount Nebo today, you will find, like you find at all the holy sites over there, you know, a shrine. And you can actually see from the top of Mount Nebo, why did God allow Moses to go to the top of Mount Nebo before he died?
See the promised land?
Exactly. And that's exactly what you can see from up there. You can see the expanse of the promised land. It's a high mountain in the south, okay, and you can see the expanse of the promised land from up there. Okay, so that's the first section of the Hebrew Bible. The second section is called the prophets. All right? Now the prophets are divided up into 2 parts. And this is where the Hebrew Bible is understood as being divided up differently than Christians understand it. All right? In the Hebrew Bible, there are former prophets and latter prophets. Okay? The former prophets consist of the books of Joshua. What happens in the book of Joshua?
They took over the promised land.
Exactly, the promised land is conquered. Okay, bear in mind that all of these books are connected by a narrative that is one narrative. It is one story. Okay, they're all connected. Right? So you've got Abraham being called, then the stories of the patriarchs. They end up in Egypt. They're enslaved by the Pharaoh. They're freed, when God sends the plagues and Moses leads them out of the promised land. They
Out of Egypt.
out of Egypt toward the promised land, and he receives the law on Mount Sinai, and off they go, and it's the second generation that makes it into the promised land. Moses dies on top of Mount Nebo at the end of Deuteronomy. So then we begin with the book of Joshua, which is the book that talks about the conquest of the Promised Land. Okay? That's part of what the Jews called the former prophets. All right? Protestants call it history. They call it former prophets. Okay, the book of Joshua, and then after Joshua, we have the book of what?
Judges.
Judges, exactly. Does anybody know what the book of Judges is about? Okay, once the Jews, now they don't conquer the whole Promised Land under Joshua. They conquer mostly the hill country, which is in the middle, okay? Along the coastline, okay, part of which now is the Gaza Strip. Along the coastline is where the Philistines are, the ancient enemies. It wasn't until King David that they were defeated. Okay, so they have part of it, but they don't have all of it. Okay, so they're constantly at war with each other. And there's how many tribes?
12.
There's 12 tribes. How are these 12 tribes governed? Judges.
Yeah.
And are they elected? No, the judges were charismatic leaders. Okay, what would happen if you read the stories of the judges? Okay, you've got these 12 tribes. They each live essentially independently. It's a little bit like the United States was before we had a constitution. We had 12 states under the Articles of Confederation with a federal government that was so weak that each state could do essentially whatever it wanted. Okay? There was no overarching authority. Okay, so they don't have a federal government. They have 12 tribes. The tribes are sometimes warring among each other, and they're warring with other groups. All right? So when they're threatened, when there's an existential threat, and by that I mean they could be wiped out, what happens? A judge arises out of the midst of the population. Nobody knows who it's going to be. You can't pick them in advance because the judges are people who are filled with the Spirit of who? God. Okay, yeah. Okay, they're filled with the Spirit of God. Okay, and that gives them the ability, they're charismatic leaders, and so they are able to bring unity among the tribes so that they will together unify to the point where they can defeat their enemies. Okay, because on their own they can't. Okay, one tribe isn't going to be able to defeat the Philistines. It's going to take all of them. And in order to do that, you got to have a charismatic leader who can bring them together. All right? So when you read the book of Judges, this is the way it will read. Before each judge, it will say, X happened. The people of Israel cried out to God, "Oh God, help us. We are about to be destroyed." And then God will send a judge. The judge will defeat the enemy. There will be a period of peace. Then the people will start to get complacent again. And then pretty soon, another enemy comes along. The people say, "Oh God, we repent. We need help." God will send another judge. And then that judge will defeat the people, the enemy. And it goes on and on and on. Exactly. It's the same thing over and over again with each judge. Whether you're talking about Deborah, Gideon, Samson, all of them. It's all the same. Okay, that's the period of what we call the tribal confederacy. All right, it's a confederacy of tribes at this point. They don't have a king, they don't have a central government, they don't have a capital city. What they have is a tribal confederacy. There is a place where there are priests, but the priests are corrupt. Okay, and what finally turns this around is that a woman by the name of Hannah. Hannah can't have a child. As we learned from the book of Genesis last week, if a woman couldn't have a child back in ancient Israel, that was a mark of shame. That was the worst thing that could happen to a woman. Okay, so Hannah's praying for a child. She's praying for a child. Finally, she says, God, if you give me a child, I will give the child to you, to your service. This child will belong to you, and this child will serve you for the rest of his days. Who becomes Hannah's child?
Samuel.
Samuel becomes the first prophet. If you don't count Moses, who is also a prophet. But he becomes the first in a long line, okay? Now, they've got a guy who everybody looks up to and who can unify these 12 tribes into something like a unified group, but there's not a government yet. Now, back in those days, what kinds of governments existed back in those days? I mean, I should put it in the singular. What kind of government existed back in those days? Kings. Kings. Okay? So the people go to Samuel and they say, Samuel, we want a king. And Samuel says, God is your king. God gave you commandments. That's where the commandments come in. Obey the commandments, and things will go well with you. So but we need a king. We need a king because there's no other way for us to have a form of a unified state that can, what can a king do? And this is what God warns them about through Samuel. Samuel says to them, if you have a king, the king is going to make you serve in the military. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your money. He's going to make you work on his building projects. He's going to do all these things, which exactly what kings did back in those days. Okay? And that's what they did. All right? So, yeah, if they got a king, they had a leader who could raise an army and defeat their enemies, but they had to deal with the downside as well. Okay? And that brings us then to the books of Samuel, which, okay, who was the first king of Israel? Saul. Okay. Saul unfortunately lost his mind. He became what sounds today, when you read the narrative, what sounds today like he had a clinical depression. He just couldn't. Being the king was too much for him to handle. He couldn't handle it. Okay. So who takes over for Saul? David. King David takes over for Saul. Now they have a king who's really a king. And these are the stories that are reported in the books of Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel, that are also part of, in the Jewish Bible, the former prophets. Okay, we consider them history, they call them former prophets. Okay, and that also includes the books of the kings, which all the kings that come after David. And this section of the Bible ends in 586 BC. Okay, so we started with Abraham, which was around 2000, give or take, BC. Okay. Archaeologically, the first mention of Israel as an entity is around 13 something. Okay, but that fits the narrative, because remember, how many years did they say they were in Egypt as slaves? Anybody remember? 400 years. Yeah. Okay. So it basically fits the narrative. Okay, so that ends the section of the Hebrew Bible known as the former prophets. Now we get to the latter prophets. The latter prophets are the books in the Old Testament that have names to them, names of prophets. And these are divided up also into two sections, major prophets and minor prophets. The major prophets are the long books, which are, who can read them for me?
Says Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
That's exactly right. Those are the three major prophets. Their books are very long. There are 12 others, from Hosea to Malachi. Those are sometimes called the 12, the minor prophets. They're shorter books, and they come after the major prophets. Now, if you read the prophets, you can tell what period of time these people lived in, because if you know the history of Israel, you can tell by what they say what period they're living in. All right. So, for example, let's take a really obvious example. Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a vision of the valley of dry bones. You remember that? Okay. God says to Ezekiel, O mortal, can these bones live? Thou knowest, Lord. Well, tell the bones to come together. Bones come together, the sinews come together, pretty soon they're covered with flesh. All of a sudden, a valley of dry bones is a group of healthy people, resurrected from the dead. What is Ezekiel talking about? Is he talking about resurrection at the end of time? Or is this about something else? Well, Ezekiel was a prophet who lived at the time when the Israelites were allowed to come back to the promised land. So what that vision was a vision of the people of Israel coming alive again and being reconstituted as God's people in the land that God gave them. That's what that vision is about. All right, so you can date the prophets based on what it is they say. If you look at Isaiah, by the way, there were 3 Isaiahs. We can tell from the different periods of time that are addressed in that book. early in Isaiah, you have prior to the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, then you have the period of time when they're in exile, then you have the period of time when they return. Okay, so the third section of the Hebrew Bible is called the writings. Okay? The writings include one historical narrative, the books of the Chronicles, which covers the same historical span as from the Torah through the former prophets. Okay? Same, but much smaller in size. And then you've got various other kinds of writings. You've got Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the story of the two guys that, okay, so when the exiles returned from Babylon to the Promised Land, Nehemiah oversaw the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and Ezra oversaw teaching the people God's law and how they're supposed to live. You've also got the books of Ruth, Esther, Daniel, Psalms, Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. Okay, all of those are considered the writings. Okay? Now, if you use the Jewish word for these, the Jewish words for these are, where did I write that? Well, the first one is Torah. Then there's okay, the second part, the prophets, is Nevi'im, N-E-V-I-I-M. The writings is Ketuvim, K-E-T-U-V-I-M. And if you put the three together, the acronym is Tanakh. So if you hear a Jewish person say the Tanakh, that means the Bible. The Tanakh is the Bible. Okay, so now I'm out of time, so we're not going to be able to get into the process of canonization, which is what Erica asked at the very beginning. So next week we'll talk in detail as to how these books were collected, how it was decided which books get to be authoritative, and what years it was that the Old Testament was formed and the New Testament was formed. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Amen.